Hey students, this is one of my family members. This is Baby. As you could see, he's wearing one of his prized possessions. He's wearing his dog tags. As you probably know, dog tags provide us with an excellent way to identify our four-legged friends if they get lost. IDs can also be added to HTML code and used by programmers in JavaScript to access or change a particular element in a web page. After watching this video, you'll understand how this works and you'll be able to assign the ID attribute in an HTML tag, reference an ID in JavaScript code using the getElementById method, use the innerHTML property to get text in an HTML tag, and use the innerHTML property to change the text in an HTML tag. Well, this is about my 10th take, and Baby's getting heavy, so let's get to work. When we work with HTML pages, there may be many elements. An element is all of the HTML code from the beginning of the opening tag to the end of the closing tag. To identify a particular HTML element on a web page, we use the ID attribute. The value of this attribute acts as an identifier, kind of like a license number is used to identify a vehicle driver, or a passport number is used to identify a traveler. The ID values on a web page should never be duplicated. This ensures that the ID uniquely distinguishes an element from all other elements on the page. As an example, you'll notice that I've opened an HTML file in a text editor. If I save this file and run it in my browser, you'll see the browser renders the page and displays the HTML. I'll return to the HTML page and I'll add an ID to the h1 tag. In the h1 tag, I'll add a space and type the ID attribute. Then I'll type the name of my ID. I'll call it page header. It's important to note that the attribute has two parts. First, we have the attribute name, which is ID. Then we have the value, which is assigned to the ID. In this case, we're calling our ID page header. So we've typed page header inside of double quotes. To perform the assignment, we put an equal symbol between the attribute name and the value. Realize that the ID itself doesn't perform any action. This is just used for identifying this particular element. If I save and run the page, you'll notice that the HTML page doesn't look any different. This is the page with the ID attribute, and this is the page before we made the assignment of the ID attribute. Now that we've identified the element using HTML, we can use JavaScript to reference the element and retrieve information from it. I've returned to the HTML file in my text editor. Next, I'm going to add script tags at the end of the body section. We must do this so that the page header ID is defined before we attempt to access it with JavaScript code. There are ways to add script tags before the HTML with events, but this is beyond the scope of this particular video. I'll scroll down to the end of the body. I'll add an opening script tag and a closing script tag. For this example, let's say I want to display some information about the page header in the console. I'll type console log and parentheses to code outputting to the console. The information I want to display in the console is about the page header. So in parentheses, I'll reference the page header by typing document dot get element by ID. The document object refers to this particular web page. getElementById is a method of the document object. I separate the object from the method using a dot, and I'll follow the method name with any arguments that I may have. The arguments will appear inside of parentheses, and this particular method, getElementById, has one argument, which is a string. The string is the ID that we want to get. Since we want to get our page header, in quotes, I'll type page header. After the closing parentheses of the argument, I'll type a dot and the name of the property that I want to display in the console. I want to display the innerHTML. Since innerHTML is a property and not a method, like getElementById, innerHTML does not take parentheses. Also realize that I did not press the Enter key on the keyboard to get to the next line. I simply ran out of space, and the text editor took me to the next line automatically. At this point, I'll save my work and display my code in the browser. Since I'm working on a Windows machine, I can press Ctrl, Shift, and J, which will display the console, and you'll notice that the console displays the innerHTML. Just to go through it again, getElementById goes through the page and finds the location of the ID referenced in between the parentheses. Since we're looking for the page header, it finds the page header on line 9. The innerHTML property refers to the text between the opening h1 tag and the closing h1 tag. In this case, it's the words the ID attribute. In our browser, the ID attribute appears as the innerHTML displayed in the console. Realize that in addition to retrieving the HTML text with the innerHTML property, we can also use JavaScript to change the text. The ability to manipulate content on a page is invaluable for creating dynamic web pages. Let's say I want to change the HTML text that I've identified as page header. To change this text, I'm going to need to reference the page header again, so I'll type document getElementById and page header again. We know that the ID attribute is the innerHTML, so this is what I'm going to change. To assign a value to the property, I'll type equals and the new string I want to see in the HTML page. I'll type the ID attribute explained. I'll finish this statement with a semicolon, and I've now assigned a new value to the innerHTML property. One last thing that I'm going to do is copy the console log statement from line 14. When I display the page in the browser, the console will show me the value that's in the page header before I make the change on line 16. Line 16 will change the innerHTML, and line 18 will show me in the console the updated value of the innerHTML of the page header ID. Let's save our work and run in the browser. I'll display the console, and you'll notice 2 lines of output appear. Right after the page loads, our script displays the innerHTML of the page header ID. Initially, the innerHTML of the page header is the ID attribute. Line 14 simply displays the information from the innerHTML on line 9. On line 16, we change the innerHTML of the page header. In the browser, you can see the ID attribute explained now appears in the HTML document. After the information on the web page is changed in line 16, you'll notice on line 18, we display the new value of the innerHTML of the page header. Since we changed the innerHTML to the ID attribute explained, in the browser, we now see the ID attribute explained appears in the console. In this video, we explored the ID attribute of an HTML element. We coded the ID attribute in the HTML tag and assigned a value. Then we used JavaScript to get information from the ID. In particular, we retrieved the innerHTML. Lastly, we showed that the innerHTML property can not only be retrieved, but it can also be changed. I hope you found this information enlightening. Don't forget to like and subscribe.